Tech tips. Wow. A big question lately has been, what is the difference between Tricon and Tricon CX? Well, I'm going to tell you. This will be a highlight of the differences between Tricon Enhanced High Density Chassis versus the Tricon CX chassis, Tricon CX being the newest. So before we go into detail, I want to highlight some of the key differences. The physical size, the chassis configuration, and the raw counts when you actually do the programming. You can see here Tricon for the 4 to 20 milliamps is 819 to 4095, whereas the Tricon CX 4 to 20 milliamps is 11,397 to 65,535. So quite a big difference. So here's an example of a Tricon main and expansion chassis on the left, with a total of 13 slots for I/O, and Tricon CX on the right with a total of 12 slots for I/O. Notice they take up about the same amount of space, but you have a different number of chassis and a different number of slots. The Tricon will generally fit 2 chassis in one typical cabinet, totaling 13 I/O slots. Whereas the Tricon CX, you can fit 4 chassis in the front with 18 slots for I/O. Now note in this configuration, you usually leave the back of the cabinet for external termination panels. However, the maximum number of Tricon chassis you can fit in a regular cabinet would be 3, although it is not recommended. The total I/O slots for that would be 21. Whereas the Tricon CX, you can actually fit 8 chassis in one typical cabinet if you go front to back. Notice the Tricon is not able to go front to back. So with the Tricon CX, you're actually able to fit 42 I/O slots in one cabinet. So looking into a little bit more detail for the main chassis, the Tricon actually has integrated power supplies, whereas the Tricon CX does not. The Tricon chassis, the main chassis, will start at chassis 1, and the node address can be set using the dials on the main processor, whereas the Tricon CX starts at chassis 0 and has a letter bug that sets the chassis number, or the node number. Tricon has the main processors, has 3 of them, just like the CX. There are communication modules up to 4 in the Tricon, and there are also up to 4 on the Tricon CX, just in a little bit of a different spot. However, you will notice that the Tricon chassis has I/O slots in the main chassis, whereas the Tricon CX does not. There are 5 I/O slots in the Tricon main chassis. And here's a side view of the main chassis, and you can tell that the Tricon CX is considerably more shallow and smaller footprint than the main chassis of the Tricon. So here we have the expansion chassis, and you'll notice on the Tricon you also have the integrated power supplies, whereas the CX does not. However, the Tricon is able to connect with other chassis through serial connection, unless you have an RXM, which you could use fiber. That's a different type of chassis. But in the Tricon CX, instead of using a different type of chassis, you can just exchange these highlighted modules shown here, and you'll be able to connect through fiber or Ethernet without changing the chassis. Now the Tricon has 8 I/O slots, whereas the Tricon CX expansion chassis has 6. Highlighted in green, you'll see the differences between the connection with external termination panels. With the Tricon, you connect via the backplane of the chassis, whereas with the Tricon CX, you connect via the FET that is connected to the backplane of the chassis. And here is the side view of the expansion chassis. Now, speaking of the FET that I mentioned just a minute ago, the Tricon CX does not use a slotted key like the Tricon does. The Tricon CX instead uses an FET. So it is a panel that connects to the backplane of the chassis, and then this area highlighted here is where the key differences come in. And depending on which FET you have installed, only the corresponding I/O module will be able to fit in this FET. They're both keyed, just in different ways. Now, there are some other key differences between the Tricon and the Tricon CX, but there are some similarities as well. Here are just a few highlights of what you can expect. The Tricon, you're able to use either AC or DC power supplies for your chassis, whereas the Tricon CX, it only allows for DC power supplies. The Tricon, if you're using fiber, you can travel. It's a much shorter distance between chassis, whereas the Tricon CX, it's a much larger distance between chassis that's available. With the Tricon, of course, since it's a little bit of an older system, there's more external termination panel options. And with the Tricon CX, there's a little bit less. However, there are still more being developed, and I'm sure more to come. So both chassis still have a SIL rating of either 1 to 3 and a maximum number of chassis of 15. Now note, with the Tricon, chassis 1 would be the main chassis, whereas the Tricon CX, chassis 1 would be the first expansion chassis. So if you're talking physical boxes, there's 16 on Tricon CX, 15 on Tricon. But if you just think about it as chassis 1 through 15, it'll make it a lot easier to remember. They also both have the same dual core processor and memory. So that about wraps it up for the differences between Tricon and Tricon CX. Hope you enjoyed.